This is Evan Watson. I'm the investigative reporter here at 13 News Now. I want to talk to you a little bit about a story that aired last night in our 11 p.m. Hold on, I'm getting a couple of things here as I get squared away on my computer. I'll let you load up and then I'll kind of start talking about what's going on here. So we're going here. We're going to go to this one. And we're going to share it this way. Perfect. All right, thanks for joining me here tonight. I know some of you probably just coming in right now. So I want to talk to you about a story that we aired and debuted last night at 11 here on 13 News Now. It's about underqualified teachers in Virginia. So this is something I started tracking actually months ago when I found out the state tracks out of field and inexperienced teachers as part of the data. So out of field is essentially a teacher who's teaching in one subject that they're not endorsed or certified for. This is different from provisional licenses, which I have gotten a lot of questions about that. This is a very different topic. This is someone in a different field. It does not mean that they are a bad teacher by any means. It just means that they were endorsed for a different subject matter. And inexperience, both of these being the state's term for it, and inexperience being just less than a year of classroom experience. So I started looking at this data, isolated it to Hampton Roads, and then I went farther than that and crossed it with some demographic data, so minority information and also socioeconomic status, and looked at schools with high percentages of economically disadvantaged students. The state tracks that as mostly students who receive free or reduced meals, some targeted assistance for needy families, and a couple other categories. And I found that in schools with 70% or higher of the percentages of economically disadvantaged students, they had about twice as many teachers who were underqualified, out of field, inexperienced, or a combination of the two. And it was an interesting look for me at an educational inequality that kind of exists in our system right now, and to have conversations with educational leaders around here, with parents, with teachers about why that may be. So I wanted to have this Facebook Live because I know it's kind of a heady topic, and answer some of the questions that you may have, talk specifically about schools if you'd like to, talk about how I got here in this and where we can go from here. I know I had a couple, I'll start before getting to the ones that are coming in this live right now, the questions. I had a couple of, we aired a video yesterday saying this was coming up, and some people asked questions on there I wanted to address. One of the ones is, why don't you ask teachers what's going on in their classrooms? And I absolutely have. I've talked to a lot of teachers about this. As you might expect, some teachers currently teaching don't quite want to go on camera or to talk about what's in their classroom, but some do, and I'd love to hear from you. If you want to interview with me, please let me know. My Facebook is linked here, my email, my phone, everything is available. You can find online. Would love to talk to you. But I hear a lot from teachers about why this may be to fill gaps, and when it becomes to out of field inexperienced or this teacher quality gap, a lot of the educational leaders say this is because of a teacher shortage. And so taking that a step farther, of course, a teacher shortage is because of many ways. Teacher compensation is one that people put to, the experience in the classroom, support from school divisions. I've heard a lot of different explanations for why that may be. So there's anything like that. And I'm looking through a couple of the comments here. So a lot of people talking about what is happening in their classroom and what that experience is like. There was one that I wanted to talk about at all. One of the comments said, I'm one of those underqualified teachers who's teaching outside of the professional discipline. I did want to clarify, this is not provisional licenses. That's many more teachers other than out of field are on provisional licenses here in Virginia. Those are the ones that are working towards becoming fully certified. This is, for example, and this is a broad general example, might not be the specific, but a science teacher who is teaching a math class because there is a gap there. That's just hypothetically speaking. So a lot of the people talking about one, lack of discipline and lack of support from the administration being why they can't keep qualified teachers in the schools. If teachers were allowed to do those jobs, some saying retiring here, we aren't paying them what they're worth. Education starts at home. This doesn't surprise me at all. Teachers need to be paid more. The education system needs to stop faulting teachers for kids in the classroom. And then one that asks, what exactly is underqualified? Virginia requires scores that are higher than minimal score requirements and goes into that. And underqualified, when I say that here, is specifically related to the state's analysis of out-of-field and inexperienced teachers, those first year and then outside of that. So let's load up some of the questions here and talk about what we got.
Sergio Neal's in. He just said, let's talk about the teacher morale.
Yeah.
And besides the pay issue, because I think people know pay, but let's talk and look at teacher morale.
Teacher morale is something that I've gotten personally on my Facebook page a lot of messages about today, saying, hey, we need to look more about the experience within the classroom, which is absolutely something I want to talk more about. When it comes to teacher morale, that can vary school to school, which can then change the retention that you're seeing in these statistics. And I often rely on statistics and data best I can as an investigative reporter in my role, because I like those kind of numbers. But then going past that, it's important to talk about the experience. So teacher morale can vary for a wide amount of reasons. I've heard from some messages today, people talking about school board or school division support, saying they had issues there, or about student behavior in the classroom. And so those things can all add up to it. And some saying that teachers aren't paid well enough to put up with the actions they're seeing in the classroom. So then it becomes a, why is this worth it? Or for the people, young people, looking at potentially going into education, why would I spend all this time, amass college debt, student loans, things like that, to not have an end goal of a high enough salary to make it even worth it, even if I wanted to put up with difficult situations to go into this profession. So those are all important questions, and I think that's something I'm going to be looking at further, speaking to you or the other people who have messaged me about teacher morale. If you're an active teacher and would like to talk to me, even if a retired teacher, a former teacher, would talk to me about what you see in the school divisions now or what you're seeing in classrooms now and how that differs, or how that might be affecting this teacher shortage or lack of teachers, I would like to talk to you. Again, please send me a message or get a time that we can set up an interview or talk a little bit more about that or get more in depth. I think that's an awesome point about why this might be happening here.
So I don't know if you have this one. Dominica Serafine wants to know, she says, I'd love to know the teacher retention data for divisions.
Teacher retention specifically?
Yeah.
I don't have that at me, so I'm trying to put that in terms of inexperienced teachers being their first year of experience. So in this data set that I have in front of me right now, those are how many teachers start in the first year. So you can look at a school, for example, let me just scroll until I see a good example of this. So Azalea Gardens Middle in Norfolk, 10% of teachers were in their first year. Same with Chesterfield Academy, Granby Elementary, 16% in Ruffner Middle. That was the example I cited in my story. By all accounts, I did want to say this to the Facebook Live, that wasn't singling out one school, that just happened to be one that stood out for me in the data set to take a look at. So teacher retention, that's very interesting because it goes more than just inexperienced teachers, but it goes to teachers who may transfer to other schools if they don't have the right experience or the best experience that they want in their own schools, or other school districts, which are messages that I've gotten today. So I will check with the state on retention specifically if we can look at how many teachers carry over from one to the next and if that goes as school. I don't know if that data set exists, but that always could be something open records request. So let me get back to you on that when it comes to Department of Education data. That's a great question. Brian, do you see anything else on there?
Yeah, Alexandria Adams just makes the comment, the salary for what is required and the education levels required is definitely part of the shortage.
Yeah, it was interesting. In the story, which is linked in the description here on this Facebook Live, if you haven't seen it yet, you're just tuning in, this is interesting to you, do check out that video and read that article. But I talked to Ben Kaiser, who's the executive director of the Virginia Association of School Superintendents, and he talked about how they're having difficulty both with recruitment and retention, but notably the pool of teachers that they have to choose from is shrinking. And they're increasingly going outside of the state of Virginia. Pennsylvania has been a long-time feeder for teachers here in Virginia, but even as far as Texas, there's some other places to try and attract teachers here. But he says that because the state's funding has lacked for years, just like that, the salary isn't high enough to then create a pool that's competitive enough to get to something like that. So The fix there, what Kaiser says, and the Virginia Public Education Commission, some other advocacy groups say the state needs to take a larger role when it comes to funding public education. So that might be delegates in this session committing to larger teacher pay raises, more money for education. Kaiser specifically talked to me about, since the recession in 2009, localities, your cities, your local city, have by percentage increased the amount they're contributing to public education, while the state has decreased that amount, or not kept in line, I guess, with the amount that you would expect to see growing. So that's part of their advocacy, the VPEC, like I mentioned, and others. But to come back to your question there, Alexandria, I believe it was, right? Yes.
Charlene Christopher raises the point, and I don't know that there's anything to link it directly to this, but her comment is, thank you for helping to shed light on some of the reasons our students are not succeeding as well as they should on the SOLs. Everybody knows, of course, standard of learning.
Right.
And I don't know if there's anecdotally what you're hearing, but if there's any kind of connection with that. People may make that assumption. That's not necessarily the case.
Sure. Yeah, so that's also interesting. Kaiser, in talking to him as well, said, hey, that assumption has validity. And I believe what you're getting at, Brian, is the connection between the more out-of-field or underqualified teachers could have a connection to SOL performance or educational performance for students. And in talking to parents, when I just walked up and presented this information for them, said, hey, do you know what an out-of-field teacher is? Do you know what this is? Do you know that your child's school has many of them? They all also assumed that the higher that number is, the more difficult it is for students to gain the best knowledge in that subject. That's kind of the assumption you can make across the board that's hinted at in this story. At least it's directly hinted at by the parent that I interviewed, and then I believe Ben Kaiser said something too, like, hey, that has validity too. I know I did and then it gets into subject matter too, which is also another part of this. Back in the fall, I believe it was, I did an investigation into the history scores in Virginia, because they dropped from 86 to 84 to 80 in terms of the passing percentages there on the SOL. And I talked to local history teachers here about why that is. And they said that students are more valuing kind of the application of history than the actual nuts and bolts of memorizing, because they're so used to just turning to their phones or whatever else to figure out when that war was or when that event happened, which was an interesting way of looking at it. So in terms of bringing it all back to these teachers having an effect on student performance data, you can make that assumption, but I can't point to direct data saying that these schools, because they have higher rates of out-of-field, inexperienced, underqualified teachers, students are doing poorer than that. It's more of a narrative in talking to the parents and people in the classroom, saying that it would be better if you have a science teacher credentialed or endorsed to teach science in that position. But the problem is that with so many gaps in the schools, they might have to fill here or fill there, or in an area that's very difficult to fill, like special education, draw from outside sources. And I guess I should also clarify here, just to make very clear on this, by no means am I ever faulting the job that many of the amazing teachers are doing in our communities. It's simply pointing out that when looking at this data and these statistics, it stands out that we are having to pull, as a society, as a collective, pull from other places, from areas where teachers are not fully endorsed in that content, to fill some of the gaps in our educational system, which, if it continues, will be a growing concern here in the Commonwealth.
Sergio actually comments that another comment from him: lack of administrative support, lack of parental support drives teachers out of the profession at an alarming rate, which I would agree with. I think a lot of teachers feel that lack of administrative support at the school level and also at the school division level a lot of times. And certainly the parental support is huge, the fact of it. Which I'm sure you're hearing from some of the teachers you've talked to or have been messaging.
Right. I had a message today from a teacher who had taught here for a long time and then just left to teach in another state simply because she felt the school division support wasn't there, but it could be elsewhere. And that speaks to, if you have a long-time teacher, this teacher, for example, taught here for 20, 25 years, leaving like that, well, you got to fill that gap. And if you can't fill that gap with an experienced teacher, then you hire someone new. But if it's tough to hire someone new because there aren't many college students going in this profession, then you fill from a different source, maybe someone from a different vocation coming into this. So that's all part of this. You have to kind of follow it through the steps as you track on back. And it's been a while since I touched on one of the big findings, so I do want to mention this again. Also, I want to point out, if you haven't looked at that web article, if you're curious about your own school or own school division, you can search in a link in there and see what the exact percentages are for your school or your school division when it comes to out-of-field or inexperienced teachers. But in talking about parental support or administrative support, when I crossed this and found that in the high economically disadvantaged schools with the students that are 70% or more of them were economically disadvantaged, and found that they were about twice as likely to have out-of-field or inexperienced teachers. That speaks to the educational inequality, but could also speak to when you're looking at administrative support or at a broader range. Should there be more resources or something allocated to different schools to help with this, to retain teachers? We talk about teacher retention being a big problem. Can we find a balance there that would make that more equal rather than having those two statistics being at odds with each other? Could that be from state funding? Could that be somewhere else? Different educators would have different ideas with that, but if you're passionate about this and continue to advocate on this topic, I think more change could come in this area to make it more of an equal playing field, which as someone who does all this reporting and looks into the data and stuff, that's really all we're trying to do. I'm hoping to shed some light on this issue that we have and find some creative solutions going forward, which is why I really like hearing from you all right now, which is really awesome. Another thing Ben Kaiser told me, and a couple of the other education leaders I talked to, couldn't fit them all into the piece, but they were saying, hey, when you talk about inexperienced teachers, just be aware that just because you are experienced does not mean that you have expertise. It doesn't mean that you're a great teacher if you have a lot more years, and you're a bad teacher if you're short. That varies a lot, so you can't draw that direct correlation. But I just saw a comment here from Stephanie that said it takes years to become expert in teaching a particular grade level or subject. And talking to the teachers, they said, hey, but you have to understand that if I'm new to teaching a particular subject, you iron out some kinks that first year. You get to see how the class is going to roll. You bring in some extra topics here or some subjects here, something you can fold into it. You know it works well and doesn't. So if you're constantly filling and plugging gaps across the school divisions or across different schools, that makes it a little more difficult to become an expert like that in the subject. So I can see both sides of that conversation for sure.
Evan, we were talking earlier just about, I know this isn't the focus of this, but we were talking about even people there are probably familiar with two career switcher programs, which have served a purpose. The teacher shortage was so bad that the General Assembly enacted and allowed that program. What kind of conversation came up about that? Did you talk about that and trying to fill these gaps, because you have to have the teachers until you can get the more qualified or the certified?
Right. Career switcher programs is what Brian was just talking to me about, and those are becoming increasingly common. We know those started here, and you see a lot of people working with those, but those also can apply to these out-of-field statistics if you're finding someone from other careers and trying to bring them into the fold. And so the question then is that something we want to increasingly do to open up the amount of options that we can have, or at what point in that balance do you want to then turn to, well, how endorsed or qualified are these people for these particular subjects? Because it is a balancing act there between accepting teachers from other fields or loosening the regulations. Virginia does have very strict regulations on who can be teaching and who's endorsed for what. I didn't even get into the provisional licenses, which is a big part of this story. That's a whole different statistic. Provisional licenses, a lot of teachers are teaching on provisional licenses as they work at a 2- or 3-year program to then get fully endorsed. Those statistics are not covered in this. I left that out because it can be a little gray, and provisional licenses does not mean that you weren't endorsed for that subject matter. It means that you're just not quite there yet, or it could mean a lot of different things. I thought it'd be better to focus on the ones that were a little bit more black and white for me, but how the reliance in Virginia to count on people from other fields to come into teachers at some point will need to be addressed, as well as what kind of endorsements or qualifications are we giving them, or what are we opening up to become more lax about, which is a conversation that's had at the state level right now. But it's an interesting conversation with education leaders. When I ask them about that, they say there's some on this side, some on this side as well.
How about, now, Stephanie Deltry brings up, this is a good point, this is whether teacher or other profession, but about the whole idea of mentoring, seasoned teachers mentoring the new ones. And I don't know, I'm trying to remember if that actually is part of, and maybe we talk about that with the mentoring, but also if that is part of the Virginia Public Education Coalition's plan for retention. Which again, if you go to Evan's story on 13newsnow.com, you can go there. It's also in this Facebook Live. You'll see the link. But there's a plan or suggestions out there to try to get the qualified teachers and also to keep them. So maybe if we talk about if that mentoring is part of that, the importance, because clearly you're not going to be the most experienced when you're a brand new teacher.
And in some of these schools that have 20% or so of teachers in their first year, if you just go 5 years, if you look at it that way, you have full turnover, even though that's not quite directly there. So I'm pulling up this plan that was interesting, kind of priorities from the Virginia Public Education Coalition, talking about both attracting teachers into the classroom and improving teacher induction. Let me make sure I have this all here as I look for it. So yeah, it talks about compensation being a big thing, which I haven't even gone back to here, which is crazy in about 8 minutes, talking about raising that being one. But preparation support, talking about the evaluation models for teachers and administrators that emphasize growth and are competency-based, some kind of incentive there. A working condition, recognize that administrative time and focus for teacher observation and support should be weighted towards novice teachers. So that gets to what Brian was talking about there, that the new ones coming in, the teachers who need the most support and the mentoring there, that in terms of working conditions, the Virginia Public Education Coalition recommends that professional development time and resources should be more weighted to those younger teachers, and that they should provide opportunities for teachers to assume ownership of their professional development, participate in the school improvement, avenues for teacher to develop professional relationships with those outside of their classroom and in the larger school community. That gets directly to what Brian was just talking about, mentorship and finding the older teachers there. And then, of course, this just leads right into the conversation about the pay scale of teachers, which is something we've reported on a lot here at 13 News Now, and that a very experienced teacher may not make that much more than an inexperienced teacher. So the incentive for that experienced teacher to continue staying in that school system and serve as a mentor to other teachers is lessened because of that. But if that were to increase, or the compensation, to go back to that point, were to increase overall, then maybe more mentorship opportunities would be available in something like that.
And Kimberly Christensen points out, and Kimberly, we do know it's not just in Virginia, it is something that's nationwide, but she says the workload versus the compensation is a huge reason why there's the shortage, in my opinion. The other thing I'll say, following up, Stephanie had commented also with the mentoring. She says it's done on unpaid time after school versus where teachers have the built-in opportunity to actually mentor instead of full day of class. By the way, now I'm going to mentor you.
Absolutely. Every teacher I've talked to, and I'm sure every teacher you've talked to, knows that the school day for them is not the first bell and the last bell ringing. It's much longer than that. And to Kimberly's point about countrywide, not just Virginia, yes, I believe it was the first soundbite there in my story is like, as you know, there is a national shortage of teachers. This is a national issue, and because it's national, makes it even harder to pull teachers from other states into the Commonwealth of Virginia, or to attract them here for these jobs, and which then leads to the other problems.
If you can probably read off Dominica, we see you as partner with, this is a good point.
Career switch,
frustration when you're talking about teachers who have a load of experience getting paid not a lot more than some of the newer ones, but that's a good point there too. She's got. Yeah,
Dominica says here, ODU has partnered with some school divisions in order to recruit teachers in high needs areas. The recruitment teacher program is entirely paid for, and those that attend get a $20,000 stipend. So while this will bring in teachers, it's very frustrating to those teachers like myself who has $30,000 in student loans, and I had to serve tables through my schooling to pay bills. student loans being a big part of this. Actually, last week, I just ran a story on the difference between trades and the growing reliance on trades and trade schools and apprenticeships here in the Hampton Roads area. And I talked to some high schoolers out in Virginia Beach who are part of a great career and technical education center over there, and they say, hey, if I can make $40,000 to $50,000 welding right out of high school, do that for 4 years while getting my schooling paid for, I don't have those student loans to come back to that I know everyone else has, as we still have failed to solve how to address making college education affordable in this country. Why wouldn't I do that, the students told me, than going into something like education where you come out with it? So even though there are options now, to Domenica's point, like the ODU partnership, which I would need to look into a little bit more to see how broad of a scope that is. I'm actually not too familiar there, but it's very frustrating to those that are still trying to pay off those same student loans without the rise in compensation that keeps up with the scale that you would hope for in something like this.
And Kimberly, we talked about this before, Kimberly mentions about the second job order, and we know there are a lot of teachers who have second jobs because there's just no way. Plus, on top of it, they're spending money out of their own pocket for classrooms and for the education.
Right. I know some people over the Virginia Beach Education Association I've worked on some stories with. They were just up in Richmond. I was up in Richmond for that teacher rally advocating for smaller class sizes, teacher compensation, and even the people working with that organization say, hey, I'm a teacher, I work at this organization, and I have other jobs because I need to at this point with my family or whatever cost it would be, which then goes right back to the compensation point we were talking about earlier. I want to touch back on that Virginia Public Education Coalition document about compensation. So obviously you want to have compensation for two reasons: recruitment and retention, enough to bring teachers into the fold, then to support them while they're there, and then encourage them enough to continue maybe with a greater rise in pay scale, something like that. But there was an interesting point in this document that they were talking about, reverse that practice of using a linear weighted average when calculating prevailing practice for teacher salaries. This practice underestimates actual costs. There's a lot to get in there, but if you'd like to, that's in this document in the VPEC at the bottom of the web article. And then also they were talking about expanding loan forgiveness and incentive program for students who choose to teach. I know multiple local school divisions around here try to do that early when students are late in high school and they could see this being a career opportunity for them, have more of those loan forgiveness or incentive programs there to come back and teach in the school division, and also expand the Virginia Teaching Scholarship Loan Program and initiate support so that new teachers can fulfill the service requirements. Also interesting thing to look at if you haven't seen this document or kind of looked at the policy that they're platforming on there. And the Virginia Public Education Coalition, I've mentioned that a few times, but it's kind of collective with member organizations being the Virginia Education Association, the Association of School Superintendents, which is where Ben Kaiser's from, who I talked to for this story, a couple of other ones also in that document right there.
I was going to try to pull up some of the stuff from yesterday, because I think we had there were a lot of good comments just from people seeing what we were going to be talking about.
I do have that pulled up here. I'm going to go back into it.
Yeah, give a second. I'm trying to scroll through on the other here to see what we've got.
Hey, it's Evan Watson.
I don't want to hear that.
No, it's me. It's me from yesterday.
Linda Newcomer yesterday, she's been, 34 years. There are a lot of people who have been doing for decades.
Yeah, decades and decades.
She says the direction's troubling.
Christina had an interesting one on here. I'm not sure how to say the last name, but they were talking about those who say it's about money aren't seeing the big picture. We know before going into the field we will be underpaid. It isn't about that. Teachers choose to teach because they want to instill learning and help children have a bright future. But then being told different things about, hey, it needs to be about the SOLs. You get different things about the standardization of education in here, the classroom experience, talking about kids throwing things or behaving a certain way that teachers literally don't know what to do because there are certain laws and rules about what you're able to do in a classroom like that. Christina says, our system's broken until it's fixed. There'll always be a teacher shortage because there are many licensed teachers like myself who refuse to teach until it's fixed. And that's another thing, that even if you have a passion and drive enough for it to get into the profession, to study for this, take on the student loans, whatever it might be, start teaching there, hopefully not out of field or one of those other areas we're talking about for this story, and you have that as that drive, you still may not be enough for retention purposes to say, hey, this is still worth it, because you start to see kind of the underbelly of this education and industry that we have with it. So that's a lot of the frustration I've been hearing from teachers, and similar to that. And it's been a while. I do want to, in case you're joining a little late here, want to come back to the original topic of discussion, which is what I found in this piece, being that out-of-field and inexperienced teachers are growing in Virginia. So people who are not endorsed or certainly in a way qualified for the subjects that they're teaching. Not that they're not qualified as teachers, but that they just might be in different subjects or to fill gaps based on a shortage. And that in the schools with students that are mostly economically disadvantaged, they have more of those teachers. They have about twice as many out-of-field and inexperienced teachers. That speaks to educational inequality in our system. It speaks to the education that those students get compared to others, which I think just about everyone will agree that you hope that all students ideally would get the same great education at all levels, but that's just not quite the case, and this is something that this imbalance can be and needs to be corrected in some way when we're looking at future fixes here. So, Brian, do you see anything from that?
Well, someone raised, I'm trying to get back to the ones from yesterday again too. Someone brought this up, and I know some of it's going to get into your base level education, what you have, but someone raised the point that you got a number of para-educators, some so-called teaching assistants, but para-educators who are in the classrooms with the teachers who may have a real interest in being a teacher and have the ability to do it. Because let's face it, and if you are a para out there, you know you do instruction in the classrooms. You're right there partnering with the teachers. But if there were some way to accelerate that and get them into more of a teaching, whether it's through some kind of licensing or
that might be, I'm not fully versed on that. That might be the path into provisionally licensed, that different subcategory that you can find. And I should say, if you don't know this exists, Virginia Department of Education, school quality profiles. If you Google that and then type in your own school, they do an awesome job of making all the data and statistics and information very accessible for you, so you can look up different things like this. There's a tab called Teacher Quality, which is where I pulled a lot of the data that I use for this story, and including that provisionally licensed. But talking about paraeducators or people who want a step into that, we've talked about some different ways already in this Facebook Live, the career switcher and the different routes into this profession, the fact that Virginia is opening up the floodgates just a little bit, even though they're still pretty strict about who can teach, to try to entice or encourage more people to consider the profession. And Brian, to answer that, I think the provisional licensure route would be the next step in there, but that also might be something that there's a gap or a step in there that I'm missing. I don't want to be misquoted or advice giving here, but that is a fair point, to retain everyone in the school system and hopefully convert or promote people to becoming fully endorsed teachers to then be in that system would be a great solution to this problem as well. So I do like that comment. That's interesting. This one really caught my eye as well. It was from Andrea Littman yesterday on the video. My daughter's favorite subject is science. She was so excited to start middle school and be in a real science classroom, but she ended up having an English teacher for science because they didn't have any more science teachers. And that's exactly what I'm talking about when I look at out-of-field teachers and the percentages there. That a teacher doesn't mean that they're not qualified to be a teacher, but they're filling a gap somewhere else. And it's an assumption that that's not as great in some way. It could be, and I'm not even jumping to that conclusion, but everyone I've talked to said, hey, it would be a lot better if we could have teachers who are endorsed and teachers who want to be teaching the subject that they are in the correct spots throughout our school system. That can only enhance the children's education, which is a big part and a kind of a unwritten part of this story, in that you would hope that your daughter, a huge science fan and a lover of science, would have someone who is a teacher who also loves science that much and wants to instill that in the young people. And so that's exactly what we're getting at. Thank you for that comment, Andrea, yesterday about.
And the one right above that too is interesting, Christina, because she points out, teachers know going in they're not getting paid. That's not to say they shouldn't be getting paid more, but they know it. But there are all these other things that may even be more factors than when you talk about pay. And it's a long comment that's there, but there was that point made too.
Yeah, Christina. Amy added that, said, I spend thousands of dollars of my own money I don't have to ensure my students have a quality education, enjoy learning. Another rallying point from the rally in Richmond last week is that, hey, we shouldn't be buying classroom supplies on our own or all of this other stuff. We should have enough in the budget to support these kind of things that are on the fringe of the classroom and learning experience. And are necessary for that. And for the teachers who are so passionate about that, that support would be needed in whatever way that comes. A lot of people do just go right to state funding and compensation, everything else. There are other ways to look at like that, and that's kind of why I wanted to have this conversation tonight, to see what you as parents, teachers, educators, just people interested in education, I think we all should be, think about this issue. So, a side note that was at the very bottom of my story, but just in case, if anyone's from Newport News or in the Newport News public school system, they, interestingly, in all the data, had 0 inexperienced teachers. I put this at the very bottom of the article. And when I see something like that, it immediately stands out to me as an investigative reporter, because I said that doesn't align with every other similar school division here. So I reached out, and the spokesperson for that public school system said there was an error in reporting the data to the state. I asked if that would be corrected, what the true numbers are. They said they had about 100 new teachers each year. I asked for specifics. They said it might not be possible to compile that data. So if you're searching a Newport News school at any point and you just see that there are no inexperienced teachers, no, that is incorrect. It is not my error. It is not the state's error. It's actually the school division's error for reporting that, and they have not corrected that at this point. So I just wanted to say that at some point as a clarifying factor. Looking here at some of the other ones. And Albert just asked, economically disadvantaged, why do we call it that? And I want to say explicitly the reason I'm using that phrase is a specific phrase that the Virginia Department of Education uses to track socioeconomic status in children and in students. And the reason why they call it that is because there's more factors that go into it. There's actually a checklist of, I think, 4. The biggest one being if students are on free or reduced meals. The next biggest one is if they're on TANF funding, and then some other support services that go into this category that they label as that. And the metrics that I use for this story is I capped it at 70% or higher, and then isolated those schools from all of the Hampton Road schools in the Excel spreadsheet that I put together, and found that about twice as many of the teachers are either out of field or inexperienced in school divisions with those student populations, showing this educational inequality.
Probably just, and Albert, I'll throw in, I'm thinking just in terms of when you say a poverty line, they're probably, when you get into poor, the terminology poor, that may dip more towards where you talk about people living in poverty, whereas you could be economically disadvantaged, but not necessarily at that lower of the levels.
Yeah, whether it's, Brian was saying, whether it's relating to poor or poverty line, or you could be above that poverty line but still receiving this assistance, and so you don't want to use that terminology if you're the state. I'm just speaking on behalf of them, because then you would be excluding students that might need the assistance, because that goes into Title I funding and all sorts of other things when you look at the funding for the education system. So I think that is why they use that specific phrase. And I know in the article I break down the exact reasons why. There's one I'm forgetting here. Let me actually pull it up. I've got it. The reason why TANF or eligible for Medicaid is the third reason why. That's from Charles Pyle with the Virginia Department of Education, who sent me that a couple weeks ago. Thank you for that information. Let me go back to that video from yesterday. There are a couple more I wanted to talk about. Lisa said, and that is why there's a teacher fair on Thursday. Right? That is why there's a teacher fair on Thursday, but hopefully there are enough applicants or people interested to come out to this and look at that. The recruitment and retention director I talked to in Virginia Beach had really great thoughts about the creative ways they're trying to attract students, to the teachers, to the profession, the programs they're doing for high school students to then go off and get a 4-year degree and then come back to Virginia Beach schools. That was very interesting to me to talk to her about that. Brian said, I'd love to be a teacher, but don't really care to go through all the schooling to do so. Is it worth 5 years of college? And then people had their thoughts on that, saying that no, but others saying yes, because an uneducated teacher is detrimental to the classroom. I believe this gets back to the point we're looking at when it comes to career switching or provisional licenses, or Virginia being willing to open up people from other fields. Maybe you could come in as an out-of-field teacher. The statistics we're talking right now, with some sort of credentials. You would need some kind of degree. It gets all very in the weeds like that. By no means am I an expert in this situation, and then as an out-of-field teacher, as a provisionally licensed teacher, then work your way up to where you want to be. But people say it depends on what you're looking for. If you want to make a difference, absolutely yes. I've been teaching 17 years. Could the pay be better? Sure, but the pay isn't why I got into it. I got into it for the relationships with students, the friendships formed, if it's something you're truly passionate about, then yes. Dawn also said, ask yourself why you want to teach. So thank you for all these comments, everybody. It's great. And just to circle back around in case you're hopping on now, it's something that I started looking into and then just got curious about. And I think there are a lot more questions than answers at this point, but I do believe the more people asking questions about it, the better when you talk about out-of-field, inexperienced, underqualified teachers and the reasons for that, not faulting that in the system, but looking a little bit deeper and talking about why that is. Most point to teacher shortage. Why is there a teacher shortage? Well, it could be compensation. It could be classroom experience. It could be school division, school board support. It could be student loans or a variety of other factors. So taking one specific issue and then zooming out to the point where you can get to a root cause and then addressing it is, I think, the best way forward. And I know the best way to look at equality in our education system and then enact change is to have a lot of people passionate and informed, importantly, about the subject, which is why I wanted to have this Facebook Live and answer any questions that you all have. Hey, Domenica, thank you so much. That's very kind of you. So I'm getting back to the comments. She said about the intricacies of the education system. It's impressive that I know it. And I want to say by no means am I an expert here, but as someone who is passionate about this and passionate about children's education and is afforded the resources to be able to look into something like this and then present that information to you, I try to be as educated as I can on the topic. And I think this is something that can use more discussion and more care and more evaluation when it comes to what we're doing from the state and the local level, what our local school divisions are investing in, where those resources are being allocated. If you get to the core tenet or finding of this story being that the high economically disadvantaged student population schools have about twice as many inexperienced underqualified teachers, should more resources be given to those schools? Should they be, and what resources are they? You know, those are two almost ethical questions, if you will, talking about educational balance. But if your answer is no, because it should be equal across the board, you would have to then acknowledge with yourself, well, the teachers who are qualified or endorsed for the content they're teaching is not equal across the board right now. So is that equality? And these are questions that I think are should be asked by parents, teachers, myself alike, and then should be answered by leaders in education, by the school divisions, by state legislators, and other people who can make a difference in that when it comes to funding resources, allocation of finances and everything else. So that's at least where I stand on it right now. Look at the data and how long career switchers last. That's another good point. I don't know where that data would be, because you'd have to then isolate the teachers that might get into personnel information, but that's very good. I think what you're alluding to in that is that the career switchers don't last long in the profession of education, which then would say, well, then you need a more holistic approach to bringing teachers on. You need the people who are committed from day one, or you need to attract people to be committed from day one by incentivizing, raising compensation, giving something that looks like it's worth it. So you don't have all the comments here on Facebook Live saying, hey, is this really worth it, worth the debt, worth the experience, worth whatever it is? And many people say for the love of the children and their growth, it definitely is, but others saying, I'm questionable right now. Maybe that's the solution to that problem. So the education system needs more attention on the teachers having more training. I will say, in looking at Virginia, there are some strict requirements when it comes to the qualifications and the endorsements teachers need to get. In fact, just a few years ago, they expanded those because it was so strict that they were having even a more difficult time finding teachers coming to this profession. But training, always important for the teachers in our classroom. Brian, do you see anything over there? I'm missing something. I know I keep looking over here. So.
The newer ones from last night. Nothing new for the current chat.
Got it.
But come on, we got more. We got dozens of people still there. You got
course.
Questions or comments? I mean, this one was not from the current chat, but last night someone said educators need to be graded just like students are.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't know where that comes in, or if they've touched on that, how they actually do. I mean, they obviously.
Yeah, there's there are certifications there. I will be the first to admit that I'm not the most knowledgeable in the grading scale for educators or how they are reviewed. I do want to answer this one from Kimberly Christensen. Where can I find this Excel spreadsheet?
It's there. I put the link in again.
You put the link in
Yep.
there? Perfect.
So it's
The link to then search, right?
the story. Yes.
Yeah.
You go in the story. There's 2 spots. The story's pinned also at the top for anybody, but yeah, there's 2 spots in the story where you can search the database.
We made it as searchable as possible, so you can type in a school or just a division and get all the answers there. But Kimberly, I will say, if you have any specific questions or you want to do some kind of analysis of your own or something, send me a message there on Facebook. I'll get back to you and then see what we can work out there. So. Yes, definitely. It's a fair point. HR will have that data, but whether they share it with me, I can tell you from working with school divisions that specific data about individuals, whether it's teachers or students, very, very tough to get, which is why I often rely on the broader data sets, which are reported to the Department of Education through these teacher quality profiles or through their master schedule collections, which is how they get this information to them. I would doubt that they would tell me how many teachers have career switched over or the retention rate of that. I do think, to the question from earlier, there's probably something I can get when it comes to teacher retention year to year. I think that's something that would be FOIable because that's not personally identifiable information. So when asking what are the retention rates for teachers in schools and if those have changed year to year, I think looking at a broader time frame for that would be really interesting. I appreciate that question because it got my reporter juices flowing. It makes me want to learn a little bit more about the subject. So that's going to be something I look into when it comes to retention. I might not be able to narrow it down to career switchers. Maybe I could if they don't include that personnel information, but who knows?
Well, the other thing I was talking to you about earlier is just figuring out how many have actually gone through it, because the ODU has offered it since 2000, so you're
Right.
talking 20 years now.
Yeah.
There's been an identified teacher shortage, so obviously we know it's not a new thing, but
Right.
it would be interesting to find out how many have completed it at least. And then, once they're in, I don't know if they track them.
Yeah. I'm saying that ODU obviously doing the career switcher for about 20 years now, so there's a lot of data there that it wouldn't be necessarily identifiable, but whether they continue to track that once they're in would be another leap. You can have knowing how many are coming through that profession, but what happens to them after would be up to the schools to track the information. I'm not sure they would, but that could be something I would reach out for. I've got this spreadsheet here.
Yeah, and they pointed out, they correct everybody who's clearly teachers, the classroom observations and things like that when you're saying, as far as an on-the-job.
Yeah, in terms of observations and evaluation systems, absolutely. Those are all, first to admit, not my expertise here on the evaluation system for teachers, but by those different areas. I thought it was interesting. I'd be interested to hear from you all. Did you know out-of-field teachers, the statistic was a part of our educational system? Did you, before seeing this, did you know kind of colloquially that, hey, a teacher might be teaching in a different subject that they're not normally teaching? Did you know that it was related to endorsements and where their expertise lies? Because I had kind of known generally that some teachers might be teaching something that they weren't endorsed for, but I didn't know it was as tracked as this and as specific when it comes to teacher quality as the Virginia Department of Education. And further than that, when typing in your school or schools near your school division, are you surprised that 2, 3, 4, 5% of teachers might be out of field at the school, which then if you expand that percentage out, even though it seems small, is quite a few teachers at the school or in the division, or that some schools could have 10 to 15% of out of field teachers. Does that surprise you as a statistic? What would you guess about inexperienced teachers, the ones with less than a year of classroom experience, seeing those statistics in the 5, 10, 15% range? Does that surprise you as well? Or is this all something you expected based on what you hear from teachers in the profession? I'd be interested if you guys have any thoughts on that. So I know for me it was a little interesting getting into this data because I didn't know it was so well tracked. One or two more I want to get back to here. In terms of teachers talking to me, I have seen some comments saying that teachers aren't allowed to talk to me or can't talk about what's going on in their schools. I want to encourage anyone that would like to say, one, legally you are allowed to express your freedom of speech, just to know that, and two, even if you just want to talk to me on background or what your experience is like, I think it's as beneficial as possible for me to hear from everyone, or as many people as I can, to then portray what I am hearing in a situation like this, in a Facebook Live or in a story, and talk about what's happening in our local schools and in schools across the Commonwealth or across the country. And it's always better for people to talk, even if it's just on background or something like that, than to say, hey, I'm not going to because I'm out of a fear of some sort of a retribution from the school division, which is an entire another issue. You don't need to get me started there, but I would love to hear from you, is the point of me saying this. And if you have any comments or questions or want to talk to me more, on my Facebook page, Evan Watson 13 News Now, my email's there, my cell phone is there. I'm very accessible. You can find me anything like that. So. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining me here and asking a lot of these questions. I'm going to look at more of them, and I'll probably have some other updates on my Facebook page. You can check there in terms of comments and other situations. And I hope you can check out this article. I think it's very beneficial, and watch this video talking about the qualifications of teachers in our area. Search your own school. Let me know what your findings are, what you're thinking about it. More thoughts on the education system. I will take all of them I can get. Would love to hear from you about this, and hopefully it caused you to think about some kind of things when it comes to out-of-field or inexperienced teachers, and also the disparity between teachers in our schools, whether you're in a school with this student population or a school with a high population percentage-wise of economically disadvantaged students, and the difference between the qualifications of teachers there, looking at that inequality in our system and how to address it. Hopefully you feel motivated or inspired to seek out some ways that you can make change on your own, or just to be more informed on this topic. So thanks so much for joining me for this Facebook Live. My Facebook's there, Twitter's there, email, cell phone, any way you want to reach me. Very accessible. Would love to hear from you. I hope you guys have an awesome night.